The stars stretched endlessly before the horizon's edge as it drifted through the outer regions of human space. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge, watching the sensor displays flicker with routine data. His crew had been mapping this sector for 3 weeks now, and nothing unusual had appeared until today. The communications officer, a young woman named Lisa Bennett, suddenly straightened in her chair and called out that they had detected an unknown vessel approaching at high speed. Jake ordered the crew to battle stations, though he hoped this would be another peaceful first contact, like the ones humanity had experienced with the 2 other species they had met in the past decade. The unknown ship was massive, easily 10 times the size of the horizon's edge, and its hull gleamed with a dark metallic finish that seemed to absorb light. As it drew closer, a transmission came through in perfect English, which immediately set off alarm bells in Jake's mind because they had never broadcast their language patterns this far out. The face that appeared on the screen was alien but vaguely humanoid, with gray skin, 3 eyes arranged in a triangle pattern, and a mouth that seemed too wide for its face. The alien introduced itself as Executor Jarn of the Valdrin Collective, and its voice carried a tone of absolute authority that made Jake's jaw tighten. Jarn explained that the Valdrin had been monitoring human transmissions for many years, and had finally decided to make formal contact now that humanity had spread to 12 worlds. Lisa stepped forward and began the standard diplomatic protocols, welcoming Jarn and expressing humanity's desire for peaceful relations. Jarn listened with what might have been amusement, then stated that the Valdrin Collective had maintained order across 400 species and 10,000 star systems for countless generations. The executor explained that humanity would now be integrated into this order, which would bring them peace, stability, and protection from the dangers of the galaxy. Jake felt his stomach drop as Jarn continued speaking. The terms were simple and non-negotiable. Humanity would surrender all military vessels to Valdrin control, accept Valdrin governors on each human world, provide annual tribute of resources and labor, and agree to limits on their technology and expansion. In return, the Valdrin would protect human worlds from external threats and allow limited self-governance in local matters. Jarn stated this offer with the casual confidence of someone who had delivered the same speech hundreds of times before. The bridge fell silent as the crew absorbed what they were hearing. Jake kept his face carefully neutral, though every instinct screamed at him to reject this immediately. He asked Jarn what would happen if humanity declined this generous offer, and the executor's 3 eyes seemed to gleam with something cold. Jarn explained that resistance would be unfortunate but ultimately futile, as 17 species had attempted rebellion over the centuries, and all had been crushed within months. Lisa asked how much time humanity had to consider the offer, and Jarn replied that they would be given 30 standard days, which was more generous than the usual 10 days, because the Valdrin recognized that humans were relatively primitive and might need extra time to understand their situation. The executor added that Valdrin warships would be positioned at the edge of human space to ensure that no hostile action was taken during the deliberation period. With that, Jarn's image vanished from the screen. Jake immediately ordered the horizon's edge to return to Earth at maximum speed. During the journey, he called a meeting with his senior officers in the briefing room. Paul Martinez, the chief engineer, pulled up scans of the Valdrin ship and noted that while their technology was impressive, it didn't appear to be overwhelmingly superior to human designs. The weapon systems looked to be energy-based rather than kinetic, and the ship's power signature suggested they were using fusion reactors similar to human models, but perhaps more efficient. Kate Sullivan, the weapons officer, studied the tactical data and pointed out that the Valdrin ship had approached in a straight line with no evasive maneuvers, suggesting either supreme confidence or a lack of combat experience against equals. She noted that every species humanity had encountered so far had been peaceful traders or explorers, but humans had spent their entire history fighting wars against each other. If it came to combat, humanity might have advantages the Valdrin didn't expect. Lisa argued that they should at least explore diplomatic options before assuming war was inevitable. She suggested that perhaps the Valdrin terms could be negotiated, that some compromise might be reached that would satisfy both sides. Jake understood her position, but he had seen enough of history to know that empires like the Valdrin didn't negotiate with those they considered inferior. They dictated terms and expected obedience. The journey back to Earth took 5 days, and Jake spent much of that time reviewing everything humanity knew about galactic politics, which admittedly wasn't much. The two other species they had encountered, the peaceful Trill and the insectoid Chaxon, had both mentioned rumors of a great power in the galactic core, but neither had provided details. Now Jake understood why. The Valdren dominated this region of space so completely that other species probably feared even speaking about them. When the horizon's edge reached Earth orbit, Jake transmitted his report directly to the United Earth Council and requested an immediate meeting with military command. Within hours, he found himself in a conference room deep beneath Geneva, surrounded by admirals, generals, politicians, and scientists. He recounted everything Jarn had said, and the room erupted into heated debate. Admiral Richard Hayes, commander of Earth's defense fleet, slammed his hand on the table and declared that humanity had not spent 10,000 years of blood and struggle, reaching for the stars only to surrender their freedom to the first bully they encountered. President Helen Carter called for calm and asked her military advisors for an honest assessment of humanity's chances in a war against the Valdren Collective. The answers were not encouraging, but neither were they completely hopeless. Jake listened as the debate raged on, and he realized that the decision had already been made in the hearts of everyone present. Humanity would fight, because that was what humans did when backed into a corner. They might lose, they might be destroyed, but they would not kneel. As the meeting concluded, Admiral Hayes looked directly at Jake and told him to prepare his ship and crew for war because in 30 days, the galaxy was going to learn that humanity answered threats not with submission, but with fire. President Helen Carter stood before the assembled representatives of Earth's nations and colonies, her face projected on screens across 12 worlds and hundreds of stations. She spoke clearly and without hesitation, telling humanity that they faced a choice between freedom and slavery, between standing proud or kneeling in submission. She reminded them that their ancestors had fought against tyranny in every generation, that humans had died by the millions to preserve liberty, and that this generation would not be the one to surrender what so many had died to protect. The response was immediate and overwhelming. From the factories of Earth to the mining colonies of the outer system, humanity began preparing for war with an intensity that surprised even their own leaders. Admiral Richard Hayes took command of the defense preparations and began pulling together every warship, every fighter, every weapon humanity possessed. The fleet numbered 347 vessels of varying sizes and capabilities, from massive carriers that could launch hundreds of fighters to small corvettes designed for fast attack runs. Colonel Dan Pierce reported to the Marine headquarters on Luna and found himself facing 10,000 volunteers who had signed up in the first week after the president's speech. He organized them into units, trained them in boarding actions and planetary defense, and watched as they transformed from civilians into soldiers. Dan had fought in the colonial wars 15 years ago, and he knew what made human soldiers different from what he had seen of other species. Humans practiced violence as an art form, refining it through centuries of constant warfare against each other. In the research facilities orbiting Venus, Dr. Amy Foster led a team of scientists working around the clock to upgrade human weapon systems. She analyzed the scan data from the Valdren ship and realized that humanity's focus on kinetic weapons rather than energy beams might be an unexpected advantage. Human railguns could punch through armor at velocities that energy shields seemed poorly designed to stop, and human missiles carried nuclear and antimatter warheads that could overwhelm point defense systems through sheer numbers. Amy pushed her team to think creatively about how to maximize their advantages. They developed new missile designs that could maneuver independently, making them harder to intercept. They created armor-piercing rounds for the railguns that could defeat energy shielding through kinetic force alone. They even designed nuclear mines that could be scattered in space and remotely detonated to create debris fields that would shred enemy ships. Commander Greg Walsh taught classes at the Naval Academy, trying to compress years of tactical knowledge into the few weeks they had before war began. He explained to his students that the Valdren expected obedience because they had always received it, that their entire military doctrine was built around overwhelming force and inevitable victory. Human doctrine was different because humans had always fought against other humans who were equally determined to win. Human tactics emphasized speed, deception, aggression, and the willingness to take casualties to achieve victory. Greg showed his students historical battles where smaller forces had defeated larger ones through superior tactics and determination. He taught them about the Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans held off an army. He showed them Midway, where American carriers defeated a superior Japanese fleet. He explained Stalingrad, where Soviet defenders turned a city into a graveyard for German invaders. The lesson was always the same. Victory came not from superior numbers, but from superior will. The Valdrin sent another emissary 2 weeks before their deadline expired. This time it was not Executor Jarn, but a different alien who introduced itself as Diplomat Vess. This one seemed more conciliatory, offering revised terms that would allow humanity to keep a limited military force and maintain greater autonomy in their internal affairs. President Carter met with Vess personally in a conference room that was broadcast live across human space. Carter listened politely as Vess explained the new offer, then asked a simple question. She asked if the Valdrin would accept these terms if another species offered them to the Valdrin. Vess hesitated, and in that hesitation Carter had her answer. She told Vess that humanity rejected the revised terms, just as they had rejected the original ultimatum. She explained that humans understood the Valdrin saw them as primitives who should be grateful for the opportunity to serve. But humans had a different perspective on their place in the galaxy. Vess warned that rejection would mean war, and war would mean the destruction of human civilization. Carter acknowledged this possibility but stated that humans would rather die free than live as slaves. She told Vess to carry a message back to the Valdrin Council. Humanity was done talking, and if the Valdrin wanted human submission, they would have to take it by force. Vess left Earth looking troubled, which gave some of Carter's advisors hope that perhaps the Valdrin might reconsider. But Carter knew better. Empires like the Valdrin never backed down from threats to their authority. The final days before the deadline were spent in frantic preparation. Jake Morrison took the Horizon's Edge through combat drills with his crew, practicing the aggressive tactics that Commander Walsh had developed. Lisa Bennett coordinated with the other ship commanders, establishing communication protocols and tactical formations. Kate Sullivan ran simulations of the coming battle, trying to predict how the Valdrin would attack and how humanity could respond. Paul Martinez worked with engineering teams across the fleet to maximize the performance of every ship. They stripped out non-essential systems to make room for additional weapons and ammunition. They reinforced armor in critical areas. They installed backup power systems and redundant controls so that ships could keep fighting even after taking severe damage. Every modification was designed with one goal: to make each human ship as lethal as possible before it was inevitably destroyed. Colonel Pierce prepared his Marines for boarding actions, knowing that if human ships could get close enough to Valdrin vessels, hand-to-hand combat would negate many of the enemy's technological advantages. He drilled his troops in zero-gravity combat, in fighting through corridors filled with hostile atmosphere, in the brutal reality of close-quarters battle where hesitation meant death. His Marines were ready to take the fight directly to the enemy, to show the Valdrin that humans were most dangerous when the fighting was personal. The deadline arrived on a Tuesday morning, Earth Standard Time. Long-range sensors detected a massive fleet entering human space from the direction of the galactic core. The computers counted over 800 Valdrin warships, each one comparable in size to humanity's largest carriers. It was a force designed to crush any resistance through overwhelming power, a force that had conquered dozens of species without significant losses. Admiral Hayes watched the sensor data from his flagship and felt a cold calm settle over him. He had been in combat before, had seen friends die, had made the hard decisions that sent people to their deaths. This would be worse than anything he had experienced, but he was ready. He opened a fleet-wide channel and spoke to every human in uniform, telling them that today they would show the galaxy what humanity was made of. Today they would prove that some things were worth dying for, and freedom stood at the top of that list. The Valdrin fleet advanced toward Terra Nova, humanity's largest colony world. Admiral Hayes had positioned his fleet there in a defensive formation, supported by orbital defense platforms and minefields. It was not the strongest position possible, but it was defendable, and it would force the Valdrin to fight on humanity's terms. As the enemy fleet approached, Hayes gave the order that would start the war. He told his ships to prepare for battle and to remember that they fought not for glory or conquest, but for the simple right to remain free. The Valdren fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel in perfect formation. 800 warships arranged in a massive wall that stretched across thousands of kilometers of space. Executor Jarn commanded from the flagship at the center of the formation, confident that this show of force would break whatever foolish resistance the humans had prepared. The Executor had personally overseen the conquest of 6 species and had never encountered significant opposition once the full weight of Valdren power was displayed. Terra Nova hung in space before them, a blue and green world that reminded Jarn of a dozen other planets that now flew Valdren banners. The orbital space around the planet was cluttered with human ships and defensive stations, a pathetic force of barely 300 vessels that seemed almost insulting in their inadequacy. Jarn opened a communication channel to the human fleet and offered one final opportunity for surrender, explaining that resistance would only result in unnecessary deaths. Admiral Richard Hayes appeared on the screen, an older human with gray hair and cold eyes that showed no fear. Jarn began to repeat the terms of submission, but Hayes interrupted with a single word that echoed across both fleets. The Admiral said no, then closed the communication channel without waiting for a response. Jarn felt something unfamiliar, a slight uncertainty about how to interpret such casual defiance, but dismissed it as the bravado of a species that did not yet understand its situation. The Valdren fleet advanced in their traditional formation, maintaining perfect spacing and coordination, as they had done in hundreds of previous battles. Their doctrine called for a steady approach that would allow their superior numbers to overwhelm enemy defenses through concentrated fire. Jarn expected the human ships to either retreat or scatter when faced with the full might of the Valdren war machine. As every other species had done, instead, the human fleet accelerated directly toward the Valdren formation at maximum speed. Admiral Hayes had divided his forces into smaller squadrons that could operate independently, and now those squadrons punched through gaps in the Valdren wall like bullets through paper. Jake Morrison commanded one of these squadrons, leading 15 fast attack ships in a charge that brought them within point-blank range of the Valdren fleet before the enemy could react. The battle erupted into chaos as human ships tore through the Valdren formation, firing railguns and launching missiles at targets that had expected to fight at much longer range. The Valdren ships were designed for broadside exchanges with other vessels that followed similar tactical doctrines, but human ships fought like sharks, darting in to strike, then breaking away before the enemy could respond effectively. Jake's squadron targeted a Valdren command ship, hammering it with railgun fire that punched through its shields and hull plating with brutal efficiency. Kate Sullivan coordinated the weapons fire from the horizon's edge, her targeting solutions refined through thousands of simulations. She watched as armor-piercing rounds tore into the Valdren ship's reactor section, and the resulting explosion took out 2 nearby vessels that had been positioned too close together in their rigid formation. She allowed herself a grim smile before acquiring the next target, knowing that every Valdren ship they destroyed was one less that could threaten human worlds. Lieutenant Nicole Grant launched from her carrier in a fighter that was smaller and faster than anything the Valdren used for close support. Her squadron of 40 fighters swept through the Valdren formation, targeting their point defense systems and communications arrays. The Valdren had fighters of their own, but they flew in predictable patterns that made them easy targets for human pilots who had trained in aggressive combat doctrines. Nicole's squadron destroyed 63 enemy fighters in the first 10 minutes of combat, losing only 8 of their own. The Valdren began to realize they were not facing the kind of opponent they had expected. Their ships started taking damage from directions they had not anticipated, and their careful formations were breaking apart under the pressure of human hit-and-run attacks. Executor Jarn ordered his fleet to tighten their formation and concentrate fire on the largest human ships, trying to impose order on a battle that had devolved into a chaotic melee. Admiral Hayes saw the Valdren attempting to regroup and immediately ordered the next phase of his plan. Every human ship in the fleet launched their missiles simultaneously, creating a swarm of over 2,000 independently maneuvering warheads that streaked toward the Valdren formation. The Valdren point defense systems were sophisticated, but they were designed to intercept orderly volleys that came from predictable directions. The human missile swarm came from every angle at once, with each warhead taking evasive maneuvers and releasing decoys. The results were devastating. Valdren ships disappeared in nuclear fireballs as multiple missiles overwhelmed their defenses. Jarn watched in growing horror as the fleet's casualty reports climbed past 50 ships destroyed, then 100, then 150. This was not how battles were supposed to proceed. The Valdren always won through superior numbers and firepower, but somehow these primitive humans were matching them, kill for kill, despite having fewer ships. Colonel Dan Pierce led a boarding party onto a damaged Valdren cruiser that had lost power after taking multiple railgun hits. His Marines moved through the alien vessel with ruthless efficiency, clearing sections with tactics refined through centuries of human warfare. The Valdren crew fought back, but they were not prepared for the aggression and coordination of human soldiers who treated every corner as a potential ambush point and every corridor as a killing ground. Pierce found Executor Jarn in the command center, wounded and surrounded by dead crew members. The alien looked at Pierce with its three eyes and demanded to know why humans fought with such ferocity over a matter that could have been resolved peacefully through submission. Pierce told Jarn that the Executor did not understand humans at all, that humanity had spent its entire existence fighting for survival against enemies, disease, starvation, and each other. Peace through submission was not peace at all. It was just a slower form of death. The Battle of Terra Nova raged for 18 hours, and by the time it ended, the space around the colony world was filled with debris and the frozen bodies of those who had died on both sides. The Valdren fleet had been shattered, with over 300 ships destroyed and another 200 damaged so badly they could barely maintain life support. The remaining Valdren vessels retreated in disorder, their perfect formations broken and their confidence shattered along with their fleet. Humanity had lost 96 ships and over 40,000 personnel, casualties that would be mourned on every human world. But they had proven something that would echo across the galaxy. They had shown that the Valdren could be beaten, that their empire was not invincible, that species with the will to fight could resist and survive. Admiral Hayes looked at the casualty reports and felt the weight of every death. But he also knew that those deaths had purchased something invaluable: hope. Jake Morrison guided the damaged Horizon's Edge back to its carrier, his crew exhausted, and several sections of the ship exposed to vacuum. Lisa Bennett coordinated damage control efforts while Paul Martinez worked miracles in the engineering section, keeping the ship's systems running despite the beating they had taken. Kate Sullivan sat at her weapons console, staring at her hands and thinking about the Valdren ships she had destroyed and the lives she had ended. News of the victory spread across human space within hours, and the response was electric. Citizens who had been preparing for the worst suddenly dared to believe that survival was possible. Volunteers flooded recruitment centers wanting to join the fight. Factories increased production, determined to replace the ships that had been lost. Humanity had tasted victory, and they wanted more. But the news also spread beyond human space, carried by the retreating Valdren fleet and by neutral traders who had observed the battle from a distance. Species that had served the Valdren for generations heard that the mighty collective had been defeated by a newcomer species that refused to submit. In the slave pens and factories of a dozen worlds, beings who had forgotten what freedom looked like began to remember. In the halls of power across the Valdren Empire, the Council of Ascendants convened an emergency session, realizing that humanity had done more than win a battle. They had threatened the very foundation upon which Valdren power rested, the belief that resistance was futile and obedience was inevitable. The Council of Ascendants gathered in their chamber on the Valdren homeworld, 9 ancient beings who had ruled the collective for over 1,000 years. They looked at the reports from Terra Nova with something approaching disbelief, because in all their long lives, they had never witnessed such a devastating defeat. The loss of 300 warships was bad enough, but the loss of face was far worse. Already they were receiving reports of unrest in the outer territories, whispers of rebellion from species that had been pacified for centuries. The eldest of the council members, a being named Supreme Ascendant Krath, declared that humanity's defiance could not be allowed to stand. He proposed assembling the Grand Armada, a fleet of 5,000 warships that would be pulled from garrison duties across the entire collective. This force would crush humanity so completely that no other species would ever dare to follow their example. The council voted unanimously to authorize the Armada, and Krath himself would take personal command of the operation. Admiral Richard Hayes had anticipated this response. and had no intention of waiting for the Valdrin to bring overwhelming force to human space. He launched Operation Hellfire, a series of coordinated raids deep into Valdrin territory using the navigation data captured from destroyed enemy ships. Human vessels struck supply depots, shipyards, and isolated garrisons, hitting the Valdrin where they were weakest and retreating before reinforcements could arrive. Jake Morrison led one of these raids, taking the repaired Horizon's Edge and a squadron of 12 ships to attack a major Valdrin shipyard at Kessian Prime. The facility was defended by only 30 warships, apparently considered more than adequate to protect against any threat. Jake's squadron emerged from faster-than-light travel directly above the shipyard, and immediately launched every missile they carried, overwhelming the defenders before they could properly organize a response. The shipyard itself was massive, capable of producing 8 capital ships simultaneously, and its destruction would set back Valdrin military production significantly. But as Jake's Marines moved through the facility to plant demolition charges, they discovered something unexpected. The workers were not Valdrin, but members of various conquered species, beings who had spent their entire lives as slaves building ships for their masters. Lisa Bennett found herself face to face with a creature that looked like a cross between an octopus and a bear, and it took her a moment to realize it was asking for help. Jake made a decision that went beyond his orders and potentially violated several regulations. He ordered his Marines to free all the slave workers and provided them with weapons from the shipyard's armory. He explained to the confused and frightened beings that humanity was at war with the Valdrin, and that anyone who wanted to fight against their former masters was welcome to join. He left them with captured Valdrin ships and navigation data to human space, then destroyed the shipyard and retreated before Valdrin reinforcements arrived. 3 days later, reports began flooding in from across Valdrin space. The freed slaves from Kessian Prime had not fled to human territory, but had instead begun raiding other Valdrin facilities, freeing more slaves and gathering more ships. Within a week, a full-scale rebellion had erupted in 3 sectors, with multiple species rising up against their Valdrin overlords. The Council of Ascendants found themselves fighting wars on a dozen fronts simultaneously. Their garrison forces stretched thin, trying to contain the spreading chaos. Dr. Amy Foster unveiled her latest creation at a demonstration for the military leadership on Mars. She called it the Prometheus system, a network of AI-assisted targeting that allowed human ships to coordinate their attacks with unprecedented precision. The system could analyze battlefield conditions in real time and suggest optimal firing solutions to every ship in the fleet simultaneously. Unlike the Valdrin hierarchical command structure where orders flowed down from commanders, the Prometheus system allowed individual ships to operate independently while maintaining fleet-wide coordination. Commander Greg Walsh led the defense of New Olympus, a mining colony on the edge of human space that suddenly found itself under siege by a Valdrin force of 150 ships. Greg had only 30 ships in the colony's orbital defenses, but he also had knowledge of the local asteroid field and a crew that understood how to use terrain to their advantage. He lured the Valdrin ships into the asteroid field where their numbers became a liability, then used hit-and-run tactics to bleed them over weeks of fighting. The Valdrin commander at New Olympus had expected the human force to surrender once the hopelessness of their situation became apparent. Instead, the humans fought harder as the battle progressed, mining asteroids and turning them into improvised weapons, using damaged ships as decoys to draw Valdrin vessels into ambushes, even ramming enemy ships when ammunition ran low. After 3 weeks of brutal combat, the Valdrin force withdrew with less than 40 ships remaining. Having failed to take the colony despite overwhelming initial superiority, Lieutenant Nicole Grant volunteered for what was considered a suicide mission. She would take a small stealth ship into Valdrin territory and infiltrate a major communications hub, then broadcast a message to every subject species in the collective. The mission had a projected survival rate of less than 5%, but Nicole argued that the potential impact was worth the risk. Admiral Hayes approved the mission, though he personally believed he was sending her to her death. Nicole's stealth ship, little more than engines and life support wrapped around a communications package, slipped past Valdrin patrols and approached the hub station. She attached her ship to the hull like a parasite and began hacking into their systems using codes captured from previous raids. It took her 6 hours to break through their security, 6 hours during which any passing patrol could have spotted her ship and ended the mission. But luck held, and she finally gained access to the communication network. Her message was simple and direct, translated into over 300 languages by the ship's computer. She identified herself as a human officer and explained that humanity had been ordered to submit to Valdran authority and had chosen to fight instead. She described the Battle of Terra Nova and the ongoing raids across Valdran space. Then she made an offer. Any species that rose up against the Valdran would find humanity standing beside them, providing weapons, intelligence, and military support. She ended with a question that would echo across the galaxy. If humans with only 12 worlds could defy the Valdran, what could 400 species achieve together? The response was beyond anything humanity had hoped for. Within days, rebellions erupted on 37 worlds. Species that had forgotten what freedom meant suddenly remembered and reached for it with desperate hunger. The Valdran found themselves fighting not one war but dozens, and their military forces were simply not large enough to contain all the fires that humanity had lit. Some rebellions were crushed quickly, but others grew stronger as freed slaves armed themselves and began coordinating with human forces. Supreme, Ascendant Krath watched his empire begin to fracture and felt something he had not experienced in centuries: fear, not fear of defeat in battle, but fear that the very idea of the Valdran Collective was being destroyed. For 10,000 years, subject species had accepted their place because they believed resistance was impossible. Humanity had proven that belief false, and now the entire structure of Valdran power was collapsing. Krath accelerated the assembly of the Grand Armada and declared that he would personally lead it to Earth, where he would destroy humanity's homeworld as an example to all species that rebellion would not be tolerated. 5,000 Valdran warships gathered at the staging point, the largest military force the Collective had assembled in over a century. Krath addressed his commanders and told them that this battle would determine the fate of their civilization. They would either crush humanity utterly or face the end of everything they had built. Admiral Hayes received intelligence reports about the Grand Armada and knew that humanity could not face such a force alone. He reached out to the rebel species that had risen up against the Valdran and proposed an alliance. Not all of them had functional warships, and those that did often had outdated technology. But they had numbers, and they had motivation. Over 2 weeks, a combined fleet assembled at the edge of human space. 300 human warships, over 3,000 ships from rebel species, and a determination to fight for freedom no matter the cost. Jake Morrison looked at the assembled fleet on his sensors and felt a strange mix of pride and dread. This force represented dozens of species that had suffered under Valdran rule, beings who had nothing in common except their desire to be free. He knew many of them would die in the coming battle, knew that victory was far from certain, but he also knew that they had already achieved something important. They had proven that unity against tyranny was possible, that beings from different worlds could fight together for a common cause. The word came that the Grand Armada had entered human space and was advancing toward Earth. Admiral Hayes ordered the combined fleet to intercept them at the Crimson Veil, a massive nebula that would complicate long-range sensors and force the battle into close quarters where human tactics. The Crimson Veil stretched across space like a wound in reality, clouds of ionized gas that glowed red from the radiation of dying stars within. Admiral Richard Hayes positioned his combined fleet at the edge of the nebula, knowing that Supreme Ascendant Krath would have to come through this bottleneck if he wanted to reach Earth. The sensors were unreliable inside the nebula, which meant both fleets would be fighting partially blind. But Hayes trusted his commanders to adapt while the Valdran relied on their rigid doctrines. The Grand Armada emerged from faster-than-light travel in perfect formation, 5,000 warships arranged in a massive sphere that could bring weapons to bear in any direction. Krath had learned from the defeat at Terra Nova and had adapted his tactics, spacing his ships further apart to prevent chain reactions from explosions and positioning point defense platforms between the capital ships to intercept human missiles. The Supreme Ascendant opened a communication channel and demanded that the rebel fleet surrender immediately or face complete annihilation. Hayes appeared on screens across both fleets, his weathered face showing the strain of months of constant warfare. He told Krath that humanity and their allies had come too far and sacrificed too much to surrender now. He explained that the Valdran had built their empire on the assumption that most beings valued survival over freedom, but they had failed to understand that some things were worth dying for. Hayes ended the transmission with a simple declaration. The galaxy had expected obedience, but today it would learn the price of demanding it. The battle began with the Valdrin advancing into the nebula, while the combined fleet fell back, drawing them deeper into the gas clouds where sensors became increasingly unreliable. Krath recognized the tactic and ordered his fleet to maintain formation and advance slowly, refusing to be drawn into a chaotic melee. But the nature of the nebula made maintaining formation difficult, and gaps began to appear in the Valdrin sphere as ships lost sight of each other in the swirling clouds. Jake Morrison led his squadron through one of these gaps, emerging from the nebula directly above a group of isolated Valdrin ships. His squadron hit them with everything they had, railguns firing at point-blank range while missiles overwhelmed the surprised defenders. The Valdrin ships tried to return fire, but their weapons were designed for long-range combat and were less effective at close quarters where human ships excelled. Jake's squadron destroyed 8 Valdrin vessels before retreating back into the nebula, having taken only minor damage. Similar attacks occurred across the battlefield as human and rebel ships used the nebula for cover, striking exposed Valdrin vessels and vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. Krath realized his formation was breaking apart and ordered his fleet to contract into a tighter sphere. But this made them vulnerable to the missile swarms that had proven so effective at Terra Nova. Admiral Hayes coordinated a fleet-wide missile launch using the Prometheus system, and over 4,000 missiles entered the nebula from different directions simultaneously. The Valdrin point defense network was impressive, but it could not track targets effectively through the interference of the nebula. Missiles that should have been intercepted kilometers away suddenly appeared on sensors at close range, and the results were catastrophic. Nuclear detonations lit up the nebula like lightning in storm clouds, and dozens of Valdrin ships disappeared in the expanding fireballs. Krath watched his casualty reports climb and felt his confidence begin to crack for the first time in his long life. Colonel Dan Pierce led a boarding action on one of the Valdrin supercarriers, a massive vessel that served as a fleet command hub. His Marines launched from their ship in armored suits, crossing the space between vessels under fire from Valdrin point defense systems. Half his force was killed in the crossing, but the survivors made it to the carrier's hull and began cutting their way inside. The fighting was brutal and personal, exactly the kind of combat where human aggression and flexibility gave them an overwhelming advantage. Pierce fought his way toward the command center, his Marines clearing sections with practiced efficiency. The Valdrin crew were not cowards, but they had never trained for the kind of close-quarters combat that humans had refined over centuries of warfare. Pierce reached the command center and found himself face-to-face with a Valdrin officer who drew a blade and charged him. The fight lasted seconds, and when it was over, Pierce had control of the carrier systems. He patched into the Valdrin communication network and began broadcasting false orders, sending ships to positions where human forces were waiting in ambush. The confusion spread through the Valdrin fleet as commanders received contradictory orders and could not verify which were legitimate. Krath's carefully planned formation dissolved into chaos as ships moved independently, trying to make sense of the conflicting information. Lieutenant Nicole Grant led her fighter squadron in a desperate attack on Krath's flagship, a vessel so massive it could barely maneuver in the confines of the nebula. Her fighters dodged point defense fire and anti-fighter missiles, losing half their number in the approach. But the survivors reached the flagship and began targeting its engines and weapon systems, their small size allowing them to avoid the ship's main batteries. Nicole herself fired the shot that destroyed the flagship's primary reactor, and the resulting explosion crippled the vessel. Jake Morrison saw the flagship's distress signal and made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered his squadron to close with the crippled flagship and finish it off. His crew hesitated because destroying a helpless ship went against their training, but Jake reminded them that this was war, and the flagship contained the enemy's supreme commander. If they could kill Krath, the Valdrin fleet might break completely. The Horizon's Edge and 3 other human ships hammered the flagship with railgun fire, punching through its weakened shields and tearing into the hull. Kate Sullivan coordinated the firing solution, and she watched on her screens as the flagship broke apart under the sustained bombardment. She felt sick at what they were doing, but understood the necessity. War was not about honor or fair fights, it was about survival. and humanity needed the Valdren to break. Supreme Ascendant Krath died when the flagship's reactor exploded, taking with him 2,000 crew members and the last hope of Valdren victory. The news of his death spread through the Valdren fleet, and the effect was immediate and devastating. Ships began to retreat without orders. Commanders made independent decisions to withdraw, and the Grand Armada started to disintegrate as a coherent fighting force. Admiral Hayes ordered pursuit, and the combined fleet fell upon the retreating Valdren like wolves on wounded prey. The battle raged for another 6 hours as the Valdren retreat turned into a rout. Ships that tried to stand and fight were overwhelmed by multiple attackers. Ships that tried to flee were hunted down by faster human vessels. By the time the fighting ended, the Valdren had lost over 2,000 ships, and another 1,000 were so damaged they would never fight again. The remainder fled back toward Valdren space, carrying news of a defeat so complete it would reshape the political landscape of the galaxy. Humanity's victory came at a terrible price. They had lost 147 ships, over 60,000 personnel, and untold amounts of equipment and resources. The rebel species had suffered even worse casualties, losing over 800 ships and hundreds of thousands of crew. Jake Morrison walked through the damaged sections of the horizon's edge and saw the bodies of crew members he had known and served with for years. The cost of freedom, he thought, had always been paid in blood. Admiral Hayes received the casualty reports and felt the weight of every death pressing down on him. He had sent these people into battle knowing many would not return, had made the calculations that determined which ships would be sacrificed to achieve victory. The mathematics of war were cold and brutal, and they left scars that would never fully heal. But he also knew that those deaths had purchased something precious, a future where humanity and their allies would remain free. The Valdren Council sued for peace 3 weeks after the Battle of Crimson Vale. They sent emissaries to Earth offering territory, resources, reparations, anything to end the war that was tearing their empire apart. President Helen Carter met with them in the same conference room where she had rejected their ultimatum months earlier, and she laid out humanity's terms. The Valdren would withdraw from all rebel territories, recognize the sovereignty of every species that had fought beside humanity, and agree to mutual non-aggression treaties with all parties. The Valdren emissaries protested that these terms would effectively end the collective as it had existed for 10,000 years. Carter told them that was precisely the point, that the age of empires built on subjugation was over, and the Valdren could either adapt to a galaxy of equals or face continued rebellion until their civilization collapsed completely. The emissaries signed the treaties and the war officially ended, though everyone knew the galaxy had been permanently changed by what humanity had done. 5 years passed, and the transformation was remarkable. The Valdren collective still existed but controlled perhaps a quarter of its former territory. Dozens of species had gained their independence,